Everyone, thank you so much for joining us to our first session of the Better Together speaker series of 2022. A couple of quick housekeeping items. In the chat, you will see there is a handout that you can use to follow along with the presentation today, and you can go ahead and add any questions you have in the chat, and myself and Chris will be monitoring it throughout the session. And then during the session, if you could keep your microphones muted, that way we don't get any background noise. And if you want to mute your camera as well, you can. It's up to you. It might help with maybe some delay or things like that. I've got a couple more people who are just jumping on, but I'm going to pass things over to Chris Vandenhogen, who is our Executive Director. Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm very excited about this topic today. I was sharing with Tina prior to us coming live here that we often get questions about alcohol and their impact and its impact on brain health. So I'm looking to learn, and so that we are equipped with this information at the Brain Center too, to be able to continue to share out. So thank you, Tina, for being with us. The Brain Center, we are a nonprofit organization here in Green Bay serving the community, and we really work through a model of care, C-A-R-E. We collaborate with other organizations like the Jackie Nitschke Center. We advocate for those that have brain disease and cognitive impairment in the community. We promote research and the advancement of science for eventually cures for some of these things that we're dealing with. And then we educate. So this is part of our educational series, the Better Together Brain Health series. We are able to do our programs and our services really because of the generosity of the community and donors. So we're very thankful for that. And specifically want to make mention of the Green Bay Packer Give Back program, who is our sponsor today and helping us conduct this series and allowing us to do what we do. So thank you to them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina. And Tina, we're so grateful to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you covering the topic, as I believe it's a pretty important one for our community and for each of us to evaluate for ourselves. So thank you. Let me do just a really brief introduction. And I think at this point, I believe I would want to share the PowerPoint, correct? So I'm going to do that. And there, I think we're good. Can everybody see the Jackie Nitschke Center? Yeah, logo. Okay, good. This might be, it's not allowing me to move or advance here. So I'm going to see if I might have the wrong version here. But now it's letting me advance. Very good. Again, welcome and thank you for taking your time to learn a little bit more about alcohol. Alcohol is a big deal in our community, certainly in Wisconsin. We celebrate with it, we mourn with it, we toast with it, we acknowledge special events in so many ways. We certainly, sports is a big part of our community. And so there's a lot that we do in utilizing alcohol as part of the experience. And so I just want to kind of take some time today to talk through a little bit about what that might mean in terms of brain development and how alcohol can impact our brains. I've been in the field of, I started out in the field of addictions over 30 years ago, prompted by my own recovery. Doesn't mean that I don't believe that people can drink responsibly and drink recreationally and be okay without consequences. I've seen it all the time, work with a lot of folks who can. So I really want to kind of explore in a kind of a non-biased way, a little bit more factual, maybe share a little bit of my experience with working with people. My background is I'm a master's level social worker, also a clinical substance abuse counselor, master of addiction counselor. And then also I do a lot of clinical supervision with a variety of different agencies in the community who provide both substance abuse and mental health treatment. It's pretty evident that there's a lot of both alcohol or other drug use and mental health issues go hand in hand. So I've really found it necessary for vital, at least from the work that I do, to be trained in both. So if there is any overlap here that anyone wants to ask any questions about, we can certainly stop and visit that. I'd really like it to be based on, or the material that we present today based on what it is that's most useful for you. So I think to just kind of share a little bit about, again, how it impacts our brains, we're going to talk a little bit about how alcohol use can move from a social experience to more significant, more of it being abusive. If just a side note, if you haven't already, if you wouldn't mind putting your putting your computer on mute, just so that we don't get any background noise, if that's something that just because of some of it being my ADD on a Monday morning, I might not be able to deal with a distraction as smoothly as I would maybe midweek. So we're going to cover this information, and again, I'm open to any kind of feedback or questions that you might have as we go. One of the things that we are aware of, as much as alcohol is, like I mentioned, significant in many of our experiences and how many of us value it, right? It's not necessarily something that we might consider a priority, but the reality is based on how many social events. One of the things that I do many times with in teaching classes or different groups that I've been a part of, I'll ask the question, can you name more than three? Actually, I'll usually use the if I'm working with a group that's kind of either court ordered or mandated in some way to be there, I'll say, you know what, we'll get out early if you can name when you get 5 minutes for every event in Wisconsin that you can name that doesn't include alcohol as part of the experience. It's really hard for people to come up with ideas. And so it's really just goes to show, again, how important it is a part of our community. I remember very early on in my recovery, a little naive and kind of big into, how the way I was living should probably be the way everybody else should live, which isn't accurate, but I've since matured in that regard. But one of the things I remember, especially based on my experience and my involvement in church, was that being a recovering person, not being able to handle alcohol, I thought, gosh, why do we have alcohol as part of our church picnic? Is there any chance that they would consider not having that as part of our church picnic? Because I knew I wasn't alone and that other people struggled with drinking. And so I got a big presentation together, probably similar to this, only on transparencies. If anybody remembers transparency machines, and prepared a pretty well thought out presentation to share with the pastoral committee, and why I think, why I thought alcohol should be not included as part of the church picnic, and so on and so forth. And they listened and they spent some good time, asked a lot of questions. I thought they really gave merit to, the information that I wanted to share. However, it was denied. And obviously the biggest issue was the amount of money that was raised, that alcohol was one of the primary fundraisers, and really would have been a significant deficit had they not included alcohol. And so it was really interesting how, the thought process was very supportive. There was a lot of commentary about how they felt it would be valuable not, to reconsider alcohol, especially with it being a family-friendly event, and some people weren't able to maintain a family-friendly experience with alcohol. So let's consider this. And at the same time, the money became a pretty significant issue. So in other words, it's valued in many, many ways, and it's highly socially acceptable. Alcohol or drinking, it's obviously legal. And so it is something that we see. It's often considered less harmful than other drugs, but I think one of the things, in fact, it's sometimes even not really even considered a drug. Many times when I talk to people, or people who will kind of share with me, they'll talk about, yeah, I drink, but I don't do drugs. But alcohol is, by nature of what it does in changing the brain, is a mood altering substance, and it is a drug. In fact, it's the #1 drug of abuse. And so it's something that we need to remember. Just because it is legal doesn't mean that it is not abused, misused, or cause significant consequences. And it can create, it doesn't always, but it can create a ripple effect burden among individuals, families, and communities. And so there was a very large study that had been conducted. I think it was first in 2013 and then again in 2018, is called The Burden of Excessive Alcohol Use in Wisconsin. And it did a really good job, I think, outlining some of the concerns related to alcohol and what it created in terms of cost for Wisconsin. And the link that's attached here, that's identified here, should be also on the handouts, That is where we can take you right to the full report, which is pretty involved. It goes through each county and identifies statistics in each county. But again, it is the Wisconsin ranks second in the United States for adult binge drinking. It rates, well, when we look at 21.5 million citizens in the United States met the criteria for alcohol addiction in the last year. And these are people who actually acknowledged it. So I believe that's an underreport. And also addiction is the third leading cause of death in the United States. So we look at addiction in general, not just alcohol addiction with that statistic, but certainly worth noting because alcohol is definitely ranks pretty high in relation to illnesses. And the Wisconsin residents in every age group engage in more binge drinking than the United States median for any age group. So we are a big binge drinking community. We drink a lot. I'll be defining that in just a minute. And we think, look at the number of 18.2 million people over the age of 18 have substance use disorder and a co-occurring mental illness. So not just mental health, not just alcohol use or other drug use, but mental health issues as well. I'm just really kind of identifying some of the concerns that we have in relation to drinking. I'm just going to move some of this information over. There we go. So binge drinking rates in 2018, which is one of the more recent stats that we have. Again, and when I say that Wisconsin ranks higher than the United States median or average, we are at 24% of our population binge drink, which is again, we have a much higher rate of binge drinking with 4.1 estimated number of binge drinking episodes per month among adults who binge drink in Wisconsin. So you can see with the map here, there's quite a few different areas where there's more significant drinking that takes place than in others, but we are definitely above the overall USA average. And just to define, binge drinking is a subset of excessive alcohol consumption. It's defined as 5 drinks per occasion for men and 4+ drinks per occasion for women within a 2-hour period. It's responsible for over 3/4 of excessive alcohol consumption costs in Wisconsin. Again, that this is referencing the burden of alcohol, excessive alcohol use rather in Wisconsin. And it really is cause for critical public health concern. The impact of binge drinking affects everyone through increased spending on healthcare, lost productivity, crime, a variety of other costs. For these reasons, the report has a considerable focus on binge drinking. So it's worthwhile taking a look at the full report. Let's make note when we talk about drinks per occasion, a standard drink serving size isn't necessarily what most people drink, especially if you know the bartender. You usually get a little bit more than what the standard drink is, but essentially a standard drink is defined as 12 fluid ounces of regular beer, 1.5 fluid ounce shot of 80 proof distilled spirits, and 5 fluid ounces of table wine. So anything that is higher in proof or has a higher level of alcohol would change that standard drink size. It would have to be less in amount. And again, excessive alcohol consumption includes binge drinking and heavy drinking, which heavy drinking is 15+ drinks over the course of a week for men and 8 or more drinks for a week for women. And really any alcohol consumption by youth who are under the age of 21 or women who are pregnant. So again, the burden of binge drinking in Wisconsin report or excessive alcohol use can be found at that link for more information. Just going to share a little bit more stats. Again, the estimated annual economic cost of binge drinking is about $3.9 billion. This is based on the 2018 more recent and the most recent evaluation of alcohol cost, and it breaks it down to $380 million in healthcare costs, $560 million in criminal justice, lost productivity, $2.6 billion, and then the other, which is associated with motor vehicle crashes, other kinds of consequences. And alcohol tax revenue collected in Wisconsin was $60.9 million. So there's a lot of, again, there's a lot of lobbying power that the Tavern League has. And there is a lot of income that we get based on taxes and taxing alcohol or liquor sales, but not quite the amount, not anywhere near the amount that it costs us. So And when we look at binge drinking, is typically responsible for about 76% of excessive alcohol consumption economic costs. So in the most recent year that this study had been completed or written, the report was in 2018. There are 2,485 alcohol-related deaths, 79,285 alcohol-related hospitalizations, and so on. So you can kind of see the numbers are pretty significantly high. And each year the numbers seem to be rising in terms of operating while intoxicated charges, alcohol-related crashes. It might have gone down a little bit, I believe, last year or year before with COVID, because there were less people out and about drinking, but certainly alcohol sales have increased significantly. And we've seen definitely devastating effects, especially on the treatment level, of how more advanced people's alcohol consumption has become during COVID and isolation. A lot of people drinking alone and also suffering some pretty significant physiological effects from alcohol that no one really is able to intervene on because they might not see it. It's one of the, we often see people who are having alcohol or drinking related issues or problems where they end up, really suffering kind of in silence, and they don't necessarily get out and show other people in their family or loved ones to what degree that they are struggling. So we take a look at, gosh, we got all these consequences. Why the heck do people drink then? Because there's a lot that doesn't necessarily cause consequences. And a lot of people can drink what we would say maybe successfully without consequences, without any kinds of negative impact. It's, social. It's for a lot of people, it's, people find it a little more easy to communicate, have fun. It enhances maybe positive experiences. So it really is, when I ask people the question, it's really to feel good. It's about having, novel feelings, sensations, experiences, to share them, to feel better, maybe to lessen anxiety, worries, fears, depression, hopelessness if people are really struggling. It's a little more dangerous when we use it medicinally to change a more unpleasant feeling, because the temptation then is anytime that unpleasant feeling occurs, that we are more likely to want to drink or use something to medicate that. And honestly, the more we do that, and it can actually happen for pleasant events too, the more that we do a behavior in relation to an experience or feeling, and the more often we do that, the more often that feeling or experience triggers a desire to use or drink, simply because our brains become wired that way. It becomes kind of like a groove in our brain that's like, oh, I feel anxiety, I'm going to drink. Or, oh, I feel worried, I'm going to drink. Or, hey, I'm having a good time, I'm going to drink. So there's those kinds of our brains become wired in a way that kind of assist that experience of being, I guess, for lack of a better word, triggered, really, to be kind of a cause and effect experience. So initially, when a person drinks hoping to change their mood, perception, or emotional state, really they're hoping to change their brain. And we're going to talk more specifically about how the brain is impacted. There's a lot of irony in that, though, in that oftentimes when the goal is to feel better, good or better, that a lot of times the continued use or overuse of substances really causes more challenge for people in terms of the consequences that can come about as a result of it. And I think even with social drinkers, that there are things that people might experience socially. And these, again, are things that cannot necessarily be seen clearly with a CT scan, but like, relationship conflicts, interpersonal problems, unplanned sexual encounters, and perhaps pregnancy, legal problems, school or work problems, low self-esteem, depression, other emotional problems can happen as a result of more significant alcohol or other drug use. I'm going to be focusing more specifically just on alcohol. So I certainly can answer any questions related to other drugs as well. We know that there's quite a lot of material and information related to other drugs, particularly with the opioid epidemic going on right now, as we experience and have probably seen a lot that has been talked about in the news. So science has generated a lot of evidence really showing that prolonged alcohol use changes the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. And those are the things I'm going to really kind of start honing in on. Again, alcohol engages systems in the motivation pathways of the brain, as I just mentioned, in terms of the, again, cause and effect. And when we look at the dopamine neurotransmission, the principal motivational system of the brain, essentially, dopamine is what really motivates us because it's a feel-good chemical, right? So this is, again, the stuff that isn't visible. CT scans can show this. Something that we don't know by looking at someone is really being able to, it's something that each of us experiences, though, every minute, every hour of every day. There's so much more about the brain that we have yet to learn, particularly as an addictions treatment field. But some things that we do know, that there are chemicals that are produced by certain parts of our brains. And those are the things we really need to pay attention to, because that's where the reinforcement happens in relation to why people drink and why they continue to drink. Sometimes, in a more heavy ways. So these chemicals are dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine travels along the functions of the pleasure centers of our brain. It's to recognize reward, pleasure, our fine skill movement, motor functioning, the frequency in which we desire or are compelled to repeat a particular experience. And then also serotonin. Serotonin travels the pathways of the brain that are responsible for mood, memory, processing, sleep, thought process. So all of that is definitely impacted. And then we look at the circuits involved in alcohol use or abuse and addiction. So it's important to recognize that habitual drinking erodes a person's ability to make sound decisions. It's the first thing to go with alcohol, by the way, is some of what would typically keep us maybe a little bit more in line. That's why people drink sometimes, is to be able to relax and chill, not have to think about, some of the daily stressors, to unwind. But with that sometimes can go judgment. And that's, again, one of the first things to be impacted. So impairing judgment, enhancing what we interpret as pleasure and reward. And as a result of the impulse to keep doing it. For those who drink frequently, it will increase their desire to keep doing it. So there's almost like after a period of time, that groove from pain to pleasure, or from anxiety to relief, or whatever it might be, that pathway becomes that groove becomes pretty well established in the brain, and therefore causes a person to want to, it reinforces them to keep drinking. Alcohol decreases inhibitions, our ability to think through our actions, our choices, or long-term impact of doing something. It increases our drive or desire to do something that might be fun or maybe less inhibited. Increases reward from doing it, holds on to the memory of how good it was when we drank. So, looking at these pieces, it's especially unique to a variety of populations. We know that, for example, there's a biopsychosocial component of developing a problem with drinking, and people who have biological predispositions, where they have family who have had or gone before them who've had substance use disorder, are much more likely to develop a problem. There are psychological components, for example, somebody who has a mental health issue, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, they're much more low self-esteem even. They're much more likely to develop a problem with alcohol if it provides that sense of relief. And then the social aspects, obviously, if it's available, accessible as part of their lives on a regular basis. Those are pieces. So let's dig into a little bit more specifically on the impact on our brain. And a person who drinks heavily over a long period of time might have brain deficits that will persist well after he or she achieves sobriety. So these are things that are long-term impacting. They might, people develop a problem, they might quit and maintain sobriety for a period of time and still deal with some of the consequences on their brain. Exactly how alcohol affects the brain and the likelihood of reversing the impact of heavy drinking on the brain really remain ongoing areas of research in our field today. We have a lot yet, like I said, we have a lot yet to learn about the brain. So we know that heavy drinking may have extensive, far-reaching effects on the brain, ranging from simple slips in memory to permanent and debilitating conditions that require lifetime custodial care. And that's a pretty scary thing for a lot of folks, especially I think as we age. I'm 49, but definitely think about it. I work a lot with people who are on Medicare and who are aging and struggling with different things that they didn't anticipate having to deal with. So it's really something that we want to pay attention to. What are we putting in our bodies at this age, even at my age or even earlier for sure, that can impact our ability to completely and fully care for ourselves as we age. And again, maintain memory and all of the things that we need to live fulfilling lives. Even moderate drinking can lead to short-term impairment, as shown by extensive research in the impact on drinking and driving, for example. So there's been probably the most research in that area, simply because there's a lot of devastating effects that can happen with alcohol and driving. And a lot of people don't think that they are as impaired as they are. It's certainly willing to answer any questions about that. That's probably a whole nother presentation really, but factors that influence how and to what extent alcohol affects the brain really are based on, how much and how often a person drinks. The age of their first drinking episode, the length of time of their drinking plays a role. Certainly the younger a person starts drinking, the more significant impact or more of a problem that can develop. And also the more significant impact it has on their developing brain, particularly. We'll be talking about that a little bit in terms of how drinking affects adolescence. The age, level of education, gender, genetic background, and family history of alcoholism definitely plays a role into how alcohol affects our brains. The risk as a result of prenatal alcohol exposure. So we refer to that as fetal alcohol effects or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, wide range of effects that impact somebody's drinking, or rather how somebody's drinking impacts the developing baby or fetus. General health status can really impact how much a person is impacted in terms of their brain and overall brain functioning. So if somebody already kind of starts out with having some kind of liver issue, for example, that adding alcohol to that, even if it's not alcohol related, adding alcohol to that can make that progression of that illness faster, and certainly liver functioning can have a significant impact on our brains. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So what is observed, and we've mentioned this before, but again, impaired judgment, unbalanced gait, blurred vision, slurred speech, slowed reaction times, impaired memory. We see these things and we don't often necessarily associate them with the brain, but our brains are definitely impacted, and that's what's causing these observed behaviors. So again, looking at the brain regions that are vulnerable to alcohol-related abnormalities, we're looking at the cerebral cortex, essentially all areas, the frontal lobe, the hypothalamus, the amygdala isn't listed in here, but that's definitely impacted. And one of the areas that most people wonder about, because blackouts, if you've heard of alcoholic blackouts, some people think that's passing out. It is not passing out. Blackouts are essentially memory lapses that occur while someone is under the influence, where they are still up, moving around. Usually there might be talking, having conversations that they don't remember the next day. And I get probably the most questions about blackouts, particularly, and also people who will not have had significant consequences like an OWI or a loss of relationship related to alcohol use, but they will be in a position where they, they start experiencing blackouts, and it scares them a bit. And then that will prompt them into start, like, I should really talk to somebody about my drinking. I don't want this to develop into more of a problem. And so I've worked with quite a few folks who've had, they've had a significant drinking history, just not a lot of consequences related to it. And they want to explore that further, and maybe have someone that they can talk to about ways to limit their drinking, or ways to cut back, or different things that strategies they can use to even explore their value of drinking, why they drink, and the relationship that they have with alcohol. So blackouts are probably, it's one of the more unique phenomena related to drinking. That can, again, occur with just social drinking. So it doesn't necessarily exist just with people who have an already established alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. So Only a few alcohol drinks can show indications of memory impairment, not necessarily blackouts, but memory impairments. Blackouts increases with use, so the memory lapses do increase with more use. Binge drinking, especially in an empty stomach, can increase the likelihood of blackouts. And essentially, blackout is the interval of time, the loss of recall of partial or entire events. Can happen during social drinking, indicating a movement to problem drinking, as I mentioned before. So we have to remember there's a difference between the genders. Typically any substance use, but alcohol especially, women are much more, and this is true of women, of people of Asian descent, African American or Black population. It's true of Native Americans as well. So women, what they all have in common is there's a lower level of dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that breaks down alcohol that assists with metabolizing alcohol. And so there is a much more of a rapid impact on a woman, or those other groups that I mentioned, that there's going to be a much more significant impact where they will experience negative consequences related to alcohol, more significantly, more and quicker physiological complications. And that includes blackouts. So women are at greater risk than males for experiencing blackouts. And that's really women metabolize alcohol at a slower rate and are more susceptible than males to milder forms of alcohol-induced memory impairment, even when men and women consume comparable amounts of alcohol. There had been a pretty kind of interesting study, and I think it was 60 Minutes or 2020, quite a few years ago now. I don't even want to admit how many years ago that was. I was early in the field, so excuse me, it had to have been about 20 some years ago. And but they did a study where they had men and women of similar body mass and similar weight and height and just similar body mass, and they basically matched them in that way, and they gave them the same amounts of alcohol to drink. And the men by far metabolized alcohol a lot faster than the women did, who are of similar body mass to them. So it really shows, again, the significance in how our bodies metabolize alcohol differently. And again, the potential consequences of that. So looking again at blackouts and memory lapses, when a person is experiencing an alcoholic blackout or alcohol-related blackout, their brain loses the ability to learn and store information from the environment around them. So this leads to what seems like a loss of, or really a loss for accounted time, that they don't have a sense of what they did during that period of time. Alcohol delays signals in the brain that control the gag reflex and other autonomic responses. A person who has blacked out or overdosed on alcohol can throw up while sleeping due to the loss of reflex control and essentially suffocate or choke to death. And that's pretty scary. That's something we've definitely seen over time. We've known of people who have passed. A lot of times those who are in the younger age groups where they are maybe 21, or they are in their college years where they're drinking excessively. One of the things that we teach people is that if your friend is passed out and they're lying on their back, please prop them on their side, put their leg up so that they don't kind of automatically turn over, because it's kind of natural for this person to lie on their back, but that they're propped up in a way that they're on their side, so in the event that they do vomit, that they don't choke. So the gag reflex just is basically asleep. And so these are things to again remember. The effects on the brain causing blackouts. Alcohol blackouts interrupt the chain of the brain. So we're talking about sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term storage. And the effects on the brain causing blackouts, sensory memory is the acknowledgement of any stimulus, and it lasts only a few seconds. And really, like every other part of the body, the brain has a system in place to classify memories into categories. So we have all heard of short-term and long-term memory, but there's a process that has to happen to get from one to the other. And this is where alcohol blackouts come into play. Again, the three stages are the short-term, long-term, and sensory memory. Excuse me. So when we look at the if they have a chance to develop further into long-term memories, the short-term memory does. And if a sensory memory is deemed important enough by your brain for your own well-being, then the information gathered will be placed forward, where you will be more aware of the sensation for a longer period of time. So your brain will subconsciously take into consideration how valuable the information will be for you in the long run. We have pretty amazing brains when you think about it, really. So the effects on the brain, again, causing blackouts from alcohol and the long-term memory pieces here is when an experience or sensation becomes more natural. It becomes a habit, a skill that is easily maneuvered, or an event that can be recalled on command. And so that long-term memory is something we've been doing for a really long time that just kind of feel like it locks in. The series of thought is known as the modal model, and it is the most general in its ability to encapsulate all other methods within its understanding. So when a person is experiencing a blackout from alcohol, the system is completely interrupted, typically cannot move further than sensory memory. However, at times short-term memories might be retained. So some of that long-term memory, or the lock-in of long-term memory or understanding, can be definitely impaired or changed by alcohol. Blackouts. When a person is experiencing an alcohol blackout, their brain loses the ability to learn and store information from the environment around them. So this leads to what, again, is that the lost or unaccounted for time. Due to the excessive intake of alcohol, the information is being blocked from the following intended brain pathways. It never makes it to the destination where the processing and recording of experiences take place. And so this is why when we finally sober up, as the alcohol is processed out of our system, we have no recollection of how time has passed or what we are doing within that time frame. And it usually becomes a blacked out like mystery, unless somebody is there to inform us of what the potentially tragic and at times embarrassing events that transpired. This is something that our field of addictions treatment, we use that to kind of assess a problem. So most average social drinkers, if they were to lose a period of time, and I usually use the example, maybe a lame one, but of watching a movie, and this would probably be true. It's like, okay, minus the alcohol, if I were to go and watch a movie and really be excited about this movie, and it was a really powerful movie, and there was this particularly moving scene that was just amazing, and after the day after the movie, I'm like, oh my gosh, that movie was so good. It's just been sticking with me. I can't remember when so-and-so did this and that and said this and how powerful that was. And if the person next to me who had been watching it right along with me says, oh, I don't remember that at all. I have no recollection of that. Like, generally speaking, if that were me anyway, I'd be a little worried. Like, why don't I remember that? If it was such a powerfully pivotal part of the movie, like, did I just zone out? Was I going to the bathroom? What is it? Did I leave? Did I use the restroom? And was I, looking for my popcorn? Like, what happened that I lost that period of the movie, or that lost that time? I have friends actually that are so hung up on movies sometimes where they're like, they remember all the lines of the movies. So it's like, I'm not quite that obsessed with movies, but it's something that, again, if I couldn't remember a really significant part of that movie, I would be worried. I'd be concerned. So people who are social drinkers really tend to be more worried about, like, whoa, I missed some time there. What did I say? What did I do? Oh my God, I said that. Oh, I can't believe I said that. Or there's an argument with a loved one about something they said while under the influence they have no recollection of. When somebody is developing more of a problem, they deny that happened. They don't acknowledge the blackout. They blow it off. They don't particularly want to talk about it. They don't want to hear about what happened, or they get really defensive in response to it. So that's something we can usually tell. If somebody's developing more of a problem, they're not going to be worried or concerned about the blackout. They'll be more about, like, not really wanting to talk about it and wanting to avoid it. Sometimes just a lot of embarrassment, maybe. So, excuse me. So effects on the brain causing, again, blackouts, just more information. Blackouts are due to how alcohol interacts with the receptors in our brain. So by blocking specific receptors during intoxication, alcohol disrupts the critical pathways that allow for communication between different parts of the brain. So this refers specifically to the hippocampus gland, which is responsible for motivation, learning ability, memory, and emotion. And in order for us to function all pathways must remain open and uninterrupted. And with any interruption can really cause some trips us up, sometimes literally, but figuratively. The specific neurons being transmitted in the brain to and from the hippocampus help create a sequence of vital patterns known as long-term potentiation, LTP. It's a series of synapses that allow us to develop and store memories. And again, that gets interrupted with alcohol. So when a person gets to the point of blacking out from alcohol, they're usually extremely intoxicated. Alcohol blackouts and alcohol poisoning coincide with each other, by the way, as I mentioned before. And a person will begin to lose all cognitive and rational thought as they habitually, as they continue to drink excessively. And blacking out can be extremely dangerous due to impaired motor functioning, the horrible judgment, bad decisions. Again, as our respiratory system, all of our systems can be impacted and impaired by alcohol. Making irrational decisions is probably one of the most challenging things. We call it unmanageability in our field, powerless manageability, where people do things while under the influence they would not normally do. If I could please remind you to mute if you are not muted, simply because I think we're getting some background information or background feedback. So again, making irrational decisions or having more charged emotional responses to something that's said, like, that, I don't know if it's liquid courage, or we get more reactive to things, that goes along with alcohol consumption in general. However, when a person is completely blacked out and still experiences these heightened or unnecessary compulsions, the brain's not able to work appropriately to restore rational thought. And things can quickly get out of hand. So, people can, it's never been a, I've heard people who have been in treatment who they talk about, yeah, I drink and I break out in handcuffs. They don't remember why they even were arrested. They have no recollection at all of it. And then they're in jail and they're like, I don't even know what my defense is. And it certainly is not a defense in court to say, oh, Your Honor, I'm sorry, I was under the influence. I was in a blackout, so I don't remember anything. Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, then we'll just dismiss the case. That obviously doesn't happen. People are still held responsible for their behavior while under the influence, despite being in a blackout, not remembering. But it's incredibly powerless. I work with the folks who, have those experiences. And it's really powerless feeling when they don't even remember what happened, or worse, they're assaulted in some way, and they don't have any of the details to hold the person accountable who assaulted them. And it honestly it doesn't matter how under the influence people are. An assault is an assault, and so it's something that we have to, again, in order to keep our memory clear, being sober is the best route to go. Women are more vulnerable to many of the medical consequences. So we talk about women having a greater vulnerability to blackouts or physiological complications related to alcohol. Women develop cirrhosis, alcohol-induced damage of the heart muscle or cardiomyopathy. They develop nerve damage or peripheral neuropathy. After fewer years of heavy drinking, they develop problems a lot quicker. And studies comparing men and women's sensitivity to alcohol induced brain damage, they're not entirely conclusive, but we do know that happens. So we see a lot more consequences for women dying, women who have excessive drinking patterns dying younger. Let's see, I just stopped I'm gonna quick stop a share. Does anybody have any questions at this time? I apologize if I'm flying through the information here. I tend to talk a little faster and also have a lot of information we're going through. So.
One is any benefits to alcohol use.
Okay.
And then perhaps at the end too, there's a question about the legalization of marijuana and your thoughts on that. So.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay, benefits to alcohol and legalization of marijuana. Okay, I'll put those down and we'll certainly come back to those. I'm not necessarily in the business of benefits to alcohol. I work with a lot of folks where there's not so much benefits, or they'd love to hear of the benefits, and that helps them to justify ongoing alcohol use. But yeah, I mean, I can certainly speak to some of that, but not in probably as great of detail as someone who's a member of the Tavern League or or looking at, again, some of how alcohol can influence blood flow. And I know that there was a study out not too long ago related to the alcoholic wine, and how, glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine it can be helpful for our hearts, for heart health. It seemed that, if I remember correctly, it was more related to an enzyme that was in the grape that was used, because the type of grape was more helpful than it had to do with alcohol. But I know a lot of people kind of, really wanted to hear more about that. And that was kind of I know that I've, certainly have family members are like, all right, yeah, like it's kind of a good example for another good reason to drink. And that's, again, if it works and there is some health effects that are beneficial, more power to you. Certainly, again, I see, just being in the treatment field of addictions, I see a whole lot more damage than benefit for folks. So again, we're talking about brain damage from other causes. So again, looking at alcohol's impact on the brain, thiamine deficiency is a common occurrence with people who have alcoholism, and it really results from poor overall nutrition. So I can't even tell you how many times I've heard, I've liquid lunches, liquid suppers, liquid breakfasts. I don't even really eat much at all when I'm drinking, because not even craving it. There are quite a few calories in certain types of alcohol, and so that seems to kind of fill people to some degree. And it also it does not provide, however, the nutrition that is needed. So vitamin B1 is an essential nutrient required by all tissues, including our brains. And that is we have a medical director at Jack Aniszki Center who says, well, if we could just put thiamine in the water, or vitamin B1 in the water, that would be great, because everyone could benefit from, who's in treatment can benefit from that vitamin, in the sense that there's so much deficiency that occurs. And up to about 80% of people with alcohol use disorder, or people who are identified as alcoholics, have a deficiency in thiamine. So it's, again, people will develop serious brain disorders over time, such as Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. WKS, or Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is also known as wet brain. If anybody's heard it said as that, it really is a disease that consists of 2 separate syndromes, a short-lived and a severe condition called Wernicke's encephalopathy, and a long-lasting debilitating condition known as Korsakoff psychosis. So it's really about the brain being significantly impaired as a result of long-term alcohol use. And I've worked with quite a few folks who have had some pretty significant cognitive impairment. The symptoms of Wernicke's encephalopathy is mental confusion, paralysis of the nerves that move the eyes, so the ocular disturbances, difficulty with muscle coordination, slow cognition, also referred, as I mentioned, also referred to as wet brain. This is, again, debilitating brain disease. Approximately 80 to 90% of alcoholics with Wernicke's encephalopathy, also known as Korsakoff psychosis, it's a debilitating syndrome. It's really characterized by persistent learning and memory problems. So people will forget. They're quickly frustrated, low frustration tolerance, have a really poor memory, have difficulty with walking and coordination, have problems remembering old information. And it is, like they have it's essentially their brain's process of laying down new information that is the most striking. They have a really hard time remembering new information. Short-term memory is impaired. It's also, it's definitely another thing that we see represented in the differences in gender. So in alcoholic men and women that reported who are both alcoholics, or in those populations, those groups, both showed significantly greater brain shrinkage than control subjects. Study also showed that both men and women have similar learning and memory problems as a result of heavy drinking. There is difference, however, in that alcoholic women reported that they had been drinking excessively for about half as long as the men in these studies. So this again indicates that women's brains, like other organs, are more vulnerable to alcohol-induced damage than men's, or at least at a more rapid pace. We call it telescoping, or at least we've heard of it as, I've read about it as telescoping. Happens a lot faster for women in terms of their effects resulting from alcohol than others. And so more research really is needed on this topic. I'm going to leave you the opportunity to kind of read more about this syndrome. It's not something that is quite as common. Sorry, does somebody have a question?
Yeah, there's a couple in the chat here.
Okay.
And maybe you touched on it a little bit, but what effects does alcohol have on someone who has a traumatic brain injury?
Well, that's a really good question. One of the things that we know about alcohol in traumatic brain injury is that it's essentially neurotoxic. So it will definitely impact somebody who already has an impaired brain much more significantly than somebody who doesn't. So it's neurotoxic in the sense that the personality changes will be much more severe, more significant. The impulse control will lessen even more significantly with alcohol on board. What the challenge to that, and you bring up a really good question, because the challenge to this, some people develop brain injury as a result of drinking, like they have falls because of drinking, or they hit their heads in ways that they probably wouldn't if they were sober. And so it's like this vicious cycle. Then they're drinking, they continue to drink. The one thing they do remember many times to do following, traumatic brain injury after treatment is that they struggle, treatment for the brain injury rather, that they struggle with still wanting to drink afterwards. And that just creates an even more challenged process of like it minimizes the healing process with brain injury, because the brain can do a lot of repair. If there's just been a fall or some kind of an injury that's significant, there is some level of repair that can happen over time, even though it takes time. The brain does some amazing work in rewiring itself, but with alcohol on board, I think it really gets its ability to do that as much more impaired and not as likely. Is there another question?
Yes. For those individuals who have been drinking for several years, does it take longer for them to quote unquote sober up after?
Definitely. It's real similar to, any kind of established behavior that we've had over time. The more we have done it, the longer we've done it, it's become a part of our lives. And so like our whole way of, doing things or functioning, if we drink during positive events or more challenging events or emotional events, there are so many more associations related to alcohol or drinking or using, that it does become more challenging for people to do any of those things without alcohol. So there's, when there's been just this established pattern of behavior over periods of time, it's the longer that behavior has gone on, as well as the chemical changes in the brain that occur, it makes it much more challenging for them to develop a whole new way of living, a whole new way of functioning, a whole new way of celebrating, just doing life on life's terms without alcohol. And that's why there's so much value put on the necessity of support, is that we, really many people have a hard time doing it alone. Like, I mean, we don't live in an island. So we're not islands in and of ourselves. So we really do rely on other people and support around us, and why there are like 12-step programs and groups that are extremely beneficial, because they provide that support and ongoing kind of challenging their old thinking, ongoing connections in a positive way that really are necessary for people to stay on task. Similar to like eating patterns in some ways, maybe a little less chemical, but gosh, sugar definitely impacts us, is definitely an addiction. And so like the more we've done a certain behavior over time, the more challenging it is to change that behavior. Any other questions? I'm just noticing the time, and I apologize. We're getting through probably half the content here, but let's see. Some of the things that would kind of touch on fetal alcohol syndrome. There's that's probably a whole nother presentation in terms of how the very early stage developing brain, how that can impact development. One of the things that, I've worked a lot with adolescents over the years, and just as the youth's body is developing and growing, so is the brain. So it's also a time where kids will experiment with alcohol, and they'll learn about how alcohol impacts or affects them. And that definitely can challenge impulsivity. It can create more challenges in terms of judgment and decision making, behavior control. All those parts of the brain responsible for that, the judgment, decision making, and behavior control, is all still developing. And so the adolescent's brain, I mean, just by nature of developing, doesn't necessarily know, can't really the reason why adolescents can't consent in some areas is because they really don't know the long-term impact of certain behaviors. And so the rational decision-making competes strongly with emotions for control of behavior in a brain that is still developing. So it's a time where, changing social roles and responsibilities, taking risks, coping, all of those pieces are parts of adolescence. And so the underdeveloped adolescent brain increases risk for making poor decisions. So there's a lot to be said for the drinking in adolescence. Honestly, the argument as to why we have the legal drinking age at 21 and not 18 or not younger, because the brain development is still, it's actually not even quite developed at 21 for men, a little slower for men than women. So any other questions at this point? I'm not seeing any.
Tina, excuse
Yes.
me, I've got a respiratory thing, so I'm not talking very well.
Oh, no worries.
But are there some resources that you would suggest that we should look into as far as articles or books that are the state of the art that you say, if you really want to learn about this, that these would be good resources?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, very much so. I mean, if you really want to dig into more related to this topic or anything alcohol or other drug related, SAMHSA, oh my gosh, I always get a little hung up on what it's SAMHSA, SAM, write it down, SAMHSA.gov, SAMHSA. So the Administration Mental Health and Substance Abuse. Trying to remember what the S stands for, but SAMHSA.gov is a really good resource, and they have all kinds of more evidence-based, not just programs, but articles and so on that are that kind of point us in the direction of kind of what is the most recent information related to addiction and related to treatment and recovery related to addiction. There's NIDA. You know what? I believe I might even have these in the references in the back on one of the last slides. So if you want that, I can certainly send them along too, because they're good resources to just really keep knowledgeable and get the most recent information as information does change in our field over time.
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
You could send it to either Chris or myself, and then we can get that out to the participants today as well.
Okay, sounds good.
So Tina?
Yeah.
This is Gary Schmidt. I was the one that asked you about the benefits of alcohol.
Yes.
I worked in addiction medicine for 10 years down in Manitowoc. I was the medical director there, the inpatient, outpatient unit. We may have even had some communication between you.
We might have.
Yeah, that was back in the 90s.
Okay.
But I now have Lewy body dementia. And I know that has a lot of sleep consequences to it. And I know a lot of people who have this dementia will use a glass of wine or a drink at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock to help them relax at evening. Not more. So they're not abusing it.
Okay.
They're using it. So that was a source of my question about it. And they find that people with this disease often will use that to help them calm down.
Okay.
The other thing that they're using, which I don't necessarily agree with, is the use of THC for that disease.
Right.
And my background in the past has led me to say, I don't think that's a good idea. But do you have any thoughts about that, about the legal use of THC for those things? And
I certainly haven't, and I'm not quite, in terms of the field, I'm not, I don't know if I want to qualify myself as an old timer, but I've been around for a long enough time where I definitely came from kind of the old school philosophy of, drug as a drug, and, that it's not a good plan with, or that THC can be a gateway drug and so on. I have softened over time with it, in part because I've seen some benefits for people. I don't I don't recommend it. I don't, certainly don't prescribe it to anybody. It's not something that I would say, oh, you know what, you're having some anxiety, why don't you try some THC? I don't say that. But I know that there are people who will try it and will talk about a lesser degree of anxiety. And I've also seen people who have tried it and are still dealing with high levels of anxiety, maybe even more at times, with including paranoia. One of the, I think maybe the only benefit, one of the benefits maybe of legalized THC is that it does become more regulated. And so you're not dealing with, marijuana that's laced with a variety of other chemicals or substances or, ditchweed or other things that are included. So there might be a little more purity around THC. One of the fascinating things about THC though, and this is probably something, Gary, you're probably aware of with your experience in the field, when I was working, I started my career working with the adolescents at Libertas Treatment Center back in the 90s. And we had kids that would come in, they were basically like a walking joint, like they used pot all day long. And the highest level of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the active ingredient that essentially causes the high. The highest level we'd ever seen in testing them was 1,000 nanograms.
Wow.
And now, when we're testing people, we're seeing like 24,000.
Oh, wow.
The level of THC is so significantly higher than ever was in the past. And I'm not just saying that because, well, when I was a kid, this is, it's just crazy how much higher it is. It amazes me that people aren't walking around like, totally like gone because of it. It's just so much higher. And perhaps as, maybe our systems have developed a tolerance to it over time. I don't know, but I can't imagine, especially as a non-user and not having used anything in 30 years, I can't imagine how I'd be landed, how bad I'd be, zoned out if I used any of that now, because it's so much higher in potency than it ever was.
It was a good presentation. I appreciate it. It was a good review for me.
That certainly means something coming from you with you having been in the field for so long. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for your service too. It's a hard field to be in for a lifetime. That's a big, long career.
Well, thank you, Tina. This has been awesome. Learned a lot. I know others have too. We've had some great questions. And is it okay if we continue to keep in touch? And if we have other questions, send them your way?
Certainly.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's a lot of information there, and I almost always pack more information than I can cover, but feel free to reach out. If you have any questions, you can use me as a resource. I'll get back to you, with any responses. And if I don't have the information, I can point to where it might be.
Thank you so much, Tina.
All right. Thank you very much.